Hello and welcome to BQ Pram. I'm Hiral Dadia. An important development that is coming in from a climate perspective is where the IMD has come out and said that the anticipation is of a normal monsoon so far. And there is a possibility or a risk of an El Nino that could be developed in the second half of the monsoon. Now, what this would mean for the industry as a whole, to discuss the same, joining us on the show today, we have Mr. Sanjeev Asthana from Patanjali. Mr. Asthana, good afternoon and welcome to the show.
Good afternoon. Thank you to have me on the show.
Absolutely, always a pleasure. Mr. Asthana, my first question coming to you is overall, now that the IMD has come out and said that it is expected to be a normal monsoon, though it's on the lower part of the range that they have, what is your view on that? And secondly, how prepared are we if a El Nino develops in the second half of the monsoon season?
So in terms of the impact, I think IMD's forecast is, I would say, a positive development because just prior to this, we had a private forecaster developing deficiency in the rainfall. So to that extent, I would certainly be more positive in terms of the as we are progressing into the monsoon season. But coming to the specifics of your question in terms of the preparedness, I think there are multiple dimensions to the preparedness. So one is, of course, how the government sort of prepares and the impact it is going to see, and which has got its own sort of implications in terms of support and subsidies and the MSP procurement, what has to happen. But from the industry's perspective, two things typically tend to sort of reflect in a poor monsoon. One is the contraction in the demand because farmers tend to sort of respond to the poor monsoon in anticipation of lesser incomes or maybe the harvesting challenges what they will face in the production side. So typically the demand goes down and it immediately starts to reflect back in consumer durables, automobiles. In a broader sense on the the food processing industry. And the last part is that I think, which is a more serious concern, is that the food inflation is a challenge right now. Because if you look at the consumer price inflation, food is nearly 50% of the CPI, and any sort of failure of monsoon in anticipation of the prices tend to go up. That reflects back in the consumer prices, and I think that is something to be worried about. But I
Right.
would say it's very early days, before we see sort of any reaction. So I would still want to wait and watch and prepare ourselves as things develop.
Right. So, Mr. Asthana, to just put this into perspective now, if someone has to understand as to what the impact on business was in the previous El Ninos, how was that looking like from a business perspective, number one? Because clearly what I was reading about, a couple of hours ago was that in the previous El Ninos, there was a 10% decline with regards to rice as well as the sugarcane crop as well. Now, taking these points into consideration, it's a direct impact in terms of raw materials and then in terms of prices, and then the vicious circle follows. So, previous El Nino impacts, how have they been for everyone to understand?
So you have to understand what is El Nino first. So El Nino is
Hmm.
more a weather pattern. It's the ocean currents in the Pacific, where there's a relationship that has been established that if you have dramatic sort of pattern changes, it has an impact on the Indian monsoons. Monsoons also have sort of two ways we have to look at it. So even though you may have a surplus monsoon, but if the rainfalls have been very irregular, which means the timeliness of the rains and the distribution of the rains is very important. So, for example, in the states which don't require much of monsoons, you may have excessive monsoons in northeast, but doesn't happen in the core growing areas. You will have definitely a problem. So, I think to that extent, I would say that on an overall basis, if the impact is on the Indo-Gangetic basin in the core growing areas in the eastern part of the country and the western part of the country, we will have a challenge. And whether the crop sort of production declining by 10% or whether the impact is much lesser. But the delta on the agriculture commodities is the issue. So, for example, your inflation tends to impact typically, even if the shortfall is just 5% in the crop production, the inflationary impact might be much greater. The delta is important. So, for the first 95%, the impact is a lot less, but the last 5 and 10% drop in can mean a lot of spike in prices. So I would say that it's still very early days. I think the key part would be that the core sort of producing regions for the kharif crop. I think that's very critical. And so from a preparedness perspective, in terms of working toward buffer stocks, looking at guiding the farmers in terms of how to manage with the deficit rainfall, if indeed that is true. How efficiently they can manage their agriculture. I think those become very important for the government and the companies which are on the input side of the business, which interface with the farmers. So that becomes very important. And I think towards that, India's preparedness is pretty good now. So we are able to sort of see the science is helping us understand how things are moving, and government is pretty much seized of it. So I think to that extent we should be in a positive sort of frame. But yes, we have to prepare ourselves. If indeed the El Nino impact is pretty damaging on the monsoons, then we have a challenge on hand.
Right. And would this mean that we will see, raw material stocking, that's the inventory, will go up specifically with regards to consumption companies? That's number one. And that impact could be felt on the working capital cycle as well?
So the impact is cascading. I think you very rightly identified that typically, companies, the good monsoon certainly reflects in good business and good sales. So to that extent, companies tend to plan much ahead in advance. And if the sales are lower, then certainly the inventory piles up, has an impact on the working capital sort of getting blocked. But I think the companies are much more savvy now. So to that extent, in terms of for them to manage the supply chains and manage the end product inventory, they're in a much better position now than perhaps they were, let's say 10 years back. So to that extent, the response time and the effective tools that are available can be managed that much better.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Asthana, so much for joining us on the show, because this gives us an overall perspective. But the key is that we will have to wait and watch as well for further developments to come in. Thank you. Stay safe and speak to you soon again.
Thank you so much.